Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm talking to Jassa Ahluwalia about his book and memoir. Both and a Half is a poignant exploration of Jassa's own heritage, Punjabi and English, and other forms of identity including faith, class, gender, and sexuality. Jassa reminds us that we are never fractions of an identity, always whole, in a myriad of beautiful, overlapping, confusing, and interconnected but empowering ways. Jassa Ahluwalia is a British actor, writer, filmmaker, and trade unionist. Born in Coventry to a white English mum and a brown Punjabi dad in 1990, he attended school in Leicester and was raised in an extended family environment. He spoke English in the playground and Punjabi with his grandparents and spent various summer holidays in India. He came to prominence as Rocky in the hit BBC Three series Some Girls, followed by starring roles in Unforgotten, Ripper Street, and Peaky Blinders. Jassa created the hashtag #BothNotHalf to explore mixed identity in light of his own British Indian heritage. His TEDx talk on how language shapes identity has clocked up over 170,000 views, and a reel on Instagram has over 5 million views. His BBC One documentary, Am I English?, won an Asian Media Award in 2022. I'm so glad to be speaking to Jassa today. Hello, Jassa. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. I'm so excited to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Samia. Thank you so much for having me. This is the first podcast I'm doing for the book, and just so excited. Thank you so much for reaching out.
Oh, that is such an honor for me to be your first podcast. And so your book, Both Not Half, is coming out into the world very soon. And I can't wait to talk to you about it today. But you are, as well as being a writer, you are an actor. So I wondered if you could just begin by telling us a little bit about your journey with acting, what that's been like, and how that has opened up spaces for you to write also.
Yeah, so I guess my breakout role was as Rocky in the BBC Three show Some Girls. That was really, I'd done a few bits before then, but that was like my first, I'm actually going to be on real TV, and people watched it, and that was like the first time I started getting recognized on the bus or anything like that. And that was wonderful. It was amazing. And then after that, I did stuff Ripper Street, did a couple of episodes on Peaky Blinders, then Unforgotten with Nicola Walker and Sanjeev Bhaskar on ITV, and then a few other bits in between. Film for BBC One called The Whale with John Boyega, David Jesse, like just incredible, wonderful experiences that money can't buy. Experiences, just incredible life experiences. And then really, as I was trying to cut, a lot of those experiences that I've just talked about came in my early 20s. And it seemed like my career was really going places. It wasn't long after we did The Whale that John Boyega did Star Wars. And then all the Marvel movies were popping off. And I was like, oh, it could happen any day now. Like I could be like the next or whatever. And then it just didn't happen. And it really forced me to reflect on what I wanted, and more importantly, who I was and who I am. And that's when I really started to realize there was this big part of me that I hadn't had the opportunity to explore on screen or on stage. And that was my mixed heritage, or not even really my mixedness. It was my Punjabiness, my Indianness that I wanted to explore, because that had been a big part of my first ever performance that's captured on camera. Is me dancing Bhangra at an Indian wedding in Punjab, in Moga, when I was like 3 years old. And in doing that, I didn't really know what to do with that for quite a long time. But then, in January 2019, I did this very silly off-the-cuff video of me speaking Punjabi, pretending to be an uncle, having a go at me for putting corn vegan pieces in my dal. I just posted it. I didn't put any subtitles on it. I didn't really even, I was still I just got back from like a job that I was working as a personal assistant at the time. I'd cycled home, had a shower. I was still in my dressing gown and my hair was wet, and I filmed it on my phone. And then I posted it that night, went to bed, woke up the next day, and it had 10,000 views or something, which in light of like my last thing, my TEDx reel that just has now hit 5 million views, seems not that crazy. But at the time, 10,000 views was like more views than I'd ever had on anything on social media. It wasn't just that it was a lot, it was all over the place. Like I was getting messages through via family in Canada, Australia. Like it was like this had gone global seemingly overnight. And that prompted me to articulate Both Not Half. When I saw a comment in the comments on the video saying this guy speaks better Punjabi than us and he's only half, and seeing the words only half prompted me to think, oh, I'm not half, am I? And I hadn't realized that I'd internalized this halfness. And as soon as I let go of that and articulated Both Not Half, that then set in motion the series of events that led to the book, which was initially, I wrote a personal essay. I'm sure we'll go into this in more detail, but I wrote a personal essay. I was trying to get it published. And then out of the blue, the TEDx Chandigarh team got in touch on Instagram and were like, hey, do you want to come and do a TED Talk? And I was like, I've got the script ready. Let's go. Did that. Then there was COVID. I didn't know if the talk was ever going to come out. Then it did. And then when that came out, I was then able to use that to then start thinking about a book. And then the opportunity arose. Somebody offered me an introduction to an agent, and went from there. And now we're here. It's been 3 years in the making of actually writing the book, and it's been a long old journey from Rocky to now.
Wow. And the book is really interesting because it's not just about your experiences, maybe like in acting or trying to understand what roles are right for you and understanding your heritage. You talk about so many different aspects of your identity and of identity generally as well, including like class, and you also talk about gender and sexuality and belonging. And I enjoyed how vast and also like in detailed your book is. And so I want to get into some of it now, the nitty-gritty of it. And I think what I'm really interested in, so you are both Punjabi, your father is from India and your mother is white English, but you are what you call white presenting. You're white. You've got really light hair, quite light eyes. Upon looking at you, somebody may not automatically think that you have Indian heritage also. And I found it really interesting reading about your life growing up. So a lot of memoirs I've read about people that are of mixed race, or books that feature mixed race characters, and I think even like someone like myself, both my parents are from Pakistan, but I was born and bred in London. I've lived my whole life pretty much in the UK with some travel here and there. And I think in a lot of cases, the sort of awakening about your racial identity, your heritage, and the othering starts quite early on. So in Layla Wazir's memoir, who I know is a friend of yours, and they're also mentioned in the book, Layla talks about it happening really early on. Layla is so inspiring and just really thoughtful. But Layla talks about an incident that happened when they were at school. I think they said they were like 6 or 7 or 8 or something. And it was an incident sparked by not being able to find the right color crayon when drawing. Yeah. I think those kind of very early experiences are really common with a lot of people that are of mixed heritage, but also, like I said, children of immigrants, people like myself. But for you, it seems that awakening didn't come until much later. And I think actually, like you talk about it coming about you about 24-ish. And I know that you also said that, I guess with hindsight, maybe there were some incidences that did come up, but generally it wasn't really the case. The angst came for you a lot later. I just wondered if you could just talk about why you think that was, and what was it about your childhood that didn't lead to it happening earlier on?
I think there's a combination of factors. Firstly, my whiteness. I think my whiteness meant that I was afforded grace when it came to engaging with culture in a way that I don't think my brown peers were. So when I think about the fact that I speak Punjabi and I've always enjoyed speaking Punjabi, I think that was largely to do with the fact that because of my whiteness, there wasn't an expectation on me to speak Punjabi. So the fact that I was trying and communicating was celebrated. if I was with brown family or in just brown settings generally, I would get a lot of positive affirmation. Be like, oh, it would be like, he's making such an effort. He's making the effort. What a great praise, celebrated. In white settings, if I was speaking Punjabi or being open about my Indianness, my culture, connection, all of that, I was a curiosity. I was something interesting. I was non-threatening because of my whiteness. So I think that was a big part of it. And I talk in the book about, and I do call out some of the uncles and aunties as well, who like have a go at their kids being like, oh, you don't speak the language, you should. And so much of the way in which they try and instill the language and the culture is through sort of assumption and shame. And I just think how different it would be, how different experiences would be for all of us. We were celebrated and encouraged. Because the thing is that my BG, my dadiji, she never really cared about whether or not I was being 100% grammatically correct or getting my words in the right order or anything like that. As long as I was communicating, like, she was happy. And I would always, she spoke English, but like nowhere near as fluently as a Punjabi. And we would always communicate in Punjabi. And it was always about that. It was just about communicating, about being able to share our love for each other. And I would occasionally have the experiences of an uncle or an auntie who was like visiting, who would I'd be like, oh, you said that wrong, and you need to really work on your Punjabi. And I was like, oh, I don't really care. So I think that was a part of it. I think also then I was growing up in Leicester, very mixed heritage city. So for me, the fact that we had the half the city closed down for Diwali was just my norm. I think that was a big part of it as well. I think also there's probably like a gender part of this as well, that I was the eldest boy of my generation, and so I was afforded, again, grace and encouragement in a way that maybe others in my family, or I think this is quite a common experience of the eldest boy can do no wrong, and then everybody else is held to very high standards. So I think it was a mix of all those things. And then probably just there's a dose of ignorance in there as well. I wasn't interacting with, because I wasn't experiencing the kind of overt racism that, say, my sister was experiencing. And at a time, I was a teenager at school. There's so many things where you're trying to figure out who you are and what's going on. That just was an element that I, because of my whiteness, age, where I was, all of that, just hadn't been exposed to, nor did I really think of it as being something that I had to figure out. And it was only then, like you say, in my early 20s, when suddenly I really wanted to find refuge and comfort and security in a world that felt increasingly confusing to me. And then suddenly it felt like that familiarity was no longer fully available to me. And that's really a bit, in a way, I love some of what you were saying earlier in the introduction, is that in a way it's a book about mixed heritage identity. In a way it is a book about the mixed heritage experience, but in another way it's also just a book about the British South Asian experience, but from the perspective of a British South Asian who looks white. And it's funny, I've only really realized that the more I've been talking to other like British South Asians and sharing experiences, being like, oh, a lot of what we experienced and what we've gone through is very, very similar. But as you say, certain key moments happened at different times because of the differences in the way in which I was perceived racially, and different childhood experiences.
Absolutely. I think there was so much in your book and the experiences that you write about that I found so relatable. And I think what was so interesting was that you go on this journey that I assume you're still on in many ways, of trying to figure out your place. And you go back into history, you delve into fiction, you do all kinds of stuff to try and understand. And that, I think, is an experience that I really share. I feel like I'm constantly trying to figure out, like, where do I exist best? What label can I give myself, or what idea explains who I am and encapsulates who I am? But I guess the reality is that there's probably not just one thing, which is what makes it so wonderful as well. The fact that there's so many different parts of who we are and what we've been through as individuals, but as collective groups as well, as South Asians, as people of the as diaspora communities and stuff. So I think it's really, really fascinating. You spent a lot of time as a child living with your grandparents, with your Dadaji and Dadiji, BG you call her. And I wonder if that also just helped you just find like a sense of calm and acceptance, and maybe you didn't question so much your identity because everything just was like very normal for you. But you also do talk about how it was still quite difficult being away from your mum, especially. Yeah, and I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on those years.
Yeah, so yeah, when I was very young, about 3, I went to live with my grandparents, my Punjabi grandparents. It's funny because to me it was like this massive moment where I suddenly was living with my BG and granddad, and for my mum and dad it was just like you were staying with them during the week because you could start school earlier in Leicester. And I think it's like really hard as adults to understand how kids like experience time. So for me as a child, 5 days of the week was an eternity. For them, it was just a standard work week. It's funny because actually I've had conversations, particularly with my mum, who also found it quite emotionally difficult at that time, about those differences. And it's been great, actually. It's been wonderful to be able to have those conversations and a reason to have those conversations, because I don't think I hadn't really fully appreciated how she viewed it as this sort of, it was about being somewhere for a short period of time for you to start school, whereas for me it was like this not cataclysm, that's probably a bit too much, but this major emotional upheaval. But you're right, it gave me access to my Punjabiness and a sense of ownership of my identity in a way that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And it's funny, I make a comparison in the book of when I'm talking about like the history of Anglo-Indians and the way in which like Anglo-Indians, so like the descendants of the mixed population in India during the colonial period, how they were deracinated from India and made English through being brought up in orphanages and away from their Indianness parents. And I make the comparison that I guess in a similar way, I grew up with my Punjabi grandparents, and as a result was made Punjabi as a result of my upbringing as well. Yeah, I think it's strange as well because it's like a cross-generational element to it as well. So I feel very much, I have a lot of affinity to like first generation immigrant experiences because I was brought up in a household where grandparents came over to the UK. I guess they were in their 30s. Yeah, I watch stuff like, I'm just trying to think, like whether it's Bend It Like Beckham or East is East or anything like that, and it doesn't feel that far removed. I feel very much like of the generation where those stories were relevant. And I guess they're still relevant, but in different ways. And yeah, I think as a result, then I just felt very much like I had a direct access to my Punjabiness. And I think maybe that's been part of the help and getting to the point where I can articulate both and not half and feel fully content in my identity, is because actually I'm not looking to anyone else to validate my Punjabiness now. And maybe that was also the thing. I think for a lot, in a way, actually, I've never needed anyone to validate my Punjabiness, but the sense of belonging that I've been craving and community that I've been craving is something that, as you probably discovered from reading the book, I was seeking that externally for a long time. And I think actually all it was about me coming to terms with the fact that this is who I am and I'm actually comfortable in who I am. And community and belonging is something that you do actively and find and create through conversations like this, not about necessarily about going somewhere or being at like a wedding or something like that. Like those are moments that maybe highlight these issues, but the actual contentment, the belonging, the community, that's very much to do with the relationship with ourselves. And then having conversations like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved what you started saying at the beginning when you said that, like, for your mum, I guess it was like quite a practical decision to send you to your grandparents for school, and also like your sister was born as well, so it was like helping out in that way as well. But as a child, you were just like, whoa, this is like a massive change in my life. Like, what is going on? And I think that that's so funny because I think about my own life, and there are so many instances where I've had a conversation with my mum as a child, or something has happened, and as a child I've been absolutely traumatized by this thing happening, and then like years later my mum will have either no recollection of this thing ever happening, or she'll just be like, "Oh yeah, that was just like really blasé." But it's
Yeah, yeah,
it's so interesting how but for you, it's very formative. Like it's really, it has such a big impact. It's so interesting to see how that, and I guess there's like a generational element there, maybe like an age or a time, or I don't know, just a different perception of it. Just how interesting that happens. Yeah, and then I guess like how we then like later process it. But
I
yeah,
guess
and
like
I really,
multi-generational parenting is like a South Asian cultural norm as well. So I think there wasn't like a sense of that being a strange or particularly different thing to be doing. I think also credit to my mum, like she very much wanted to make sure that I was exposed to heritage and culture from a very early age. My mum made an effort to learn Punjabi. She I went to India with my granddad over the summer holidays when I always say the ages all mixed together in my head. I think it was like 94 or 95. But I was very young. I'd been to India once for this wedding, and then I went the following summer, I think, with my granddad. She knew that for me to go to India with my granddad and to be there for the summer and meet family and have that time was important. It wasn't an accident that like either. Yeah, there was the practical element of my sister had just been born, childcare costs, we need to get Jassa into school, but also a concerted effort as well to be like, they gave me my name knowing that on appearance alone, my heritage would be something that wouldn't be obvious to people. So there was a very conscious effort from both my parents to make sure that I had a strong connection to my roots and heritage.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, reading a book, was in complete awe of your mother, especially because I really feel like just when she did everything she could, even before you were born, when she was like meeting your grandparents for the first time. And I think that speaks volumes really as to who she is and what kind of woman she is and how determined she was to be there for your father. And then for you, especially knowing that you are Punjabi, but you look white. That must have been also very difficult for her to try to understand how to deal with this, because this is a different situation if you are a brown baby, because it's very different, I think. And I just, yeah, I think she's clearly, from your work, like she's done so much. And I don't know if I was in a position like that, can I say like fully that I would be as committed? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that I would be, but like there is a lot. Like she learned the language, and just to be, I think, sure and determined to help you and to create that situation and the circumstances for you, I think it's just great. And it's just great. And I know as well
because like when I had that moment of, oh, I think I've got a bit of an issue here, I don't quite know how to make sense of myself you raise me to be whole and multiple, but the world is divided and fractional and wants to put people into boxes. And I think she found that quite upsetting because she felt like she'd somehow done something wrong by feeling like she hadn't properly prepared me or had created a problem in some way. I had to really reassure her, you did everything right. It's just the world is the world. And this is hopefully what this conversation is making a small contribution towards changing, is for this not to be particularly noteworthy. It shouldn't be. And also there's historical precedent. It never used to be within India during the colonial period. Anglo-Indians were known and understood. It was understood that an Anglo-Indian could look like me. It was also understood that an Anglo-Indian could look like you. There was a whole range. There was a much deeper understanding, bizarrely, at that time. But yeah, I find it bizarre that the mixed population, they featured on the very first census of India, of the whole India census, like in the very early, I've forgotten the date now, is it early 18 and late 1800s, I think. I have to check my own book. But like really early on. But then like mixed didn't appear on the UK census until 2000 or something, like when I was 10 years old. And I was like, that's mad.
I know. Oh my gosh. That does feel, yeah. I think that isn't the only thing. If we look worldwide, I think there has been a greater appreciation of differences in gender and sexuality, and also race and mixed heritage worldwide. And the UK has caught up very slowly. Like, historically, Britain has not been accepting. Britain has been very binary in its race, gender, culture, and also sexuality as well, in its like understanding and acceptance of it. But we know that around the world that hasn't been the case. And I guess politically, maybe it's like a slightly different thing with laws and whatnot. But in terms of like society, there are many societies around the world that have been a lot more open and warm to difference and just different forms of identity and different ways of being and expressing yourself and who you really are than the UK. The UK has always been really very rigid. And that's one issue with the UK.
Yeah.
But you are...
Go back to, and I always make this point, just made it on St. George's Day, is that the Kingdom of England emerged out of this meeting together of like Angles, Jutes, Celts, and it was a whole mix of people that came together. So I know I'm going quite far back, but it's not counter to British or English history for our identity to be multiple. And I always make the point that to be English is to be mixed. And I think I'm very much about trying to change and counter and engage with those narratives, because I agree. I think the time we're in now is one that is very binary and fractured and wants to put people in certain boxes, but suggest that is to resist that is something new and modern. It doesn't run counter to our history to be a mix of peoples.
So you talk a lot about history in your book, and I found it really moving when you reflect on a quote that talks about trying to find, when you're trying to understand who you are, to romanticize a period in history, and you try and go back. And I think I do that a lot when I talk about my Pakistani identity. I talk about partition a lot, and I know that I, as a result, I'm romanticizing the pre-partition area. So I'm romanticizing pre-1920. I don't actually know if pre-1920 India is as great as I think it was. But for me, I seem to find I'm very drawn to it. So I was really I felt such a affinity to that. So what has it been for you reading about the history of Punjab, especially in India, and how has that impacted your idea of yourself?
Oh, wow. Just the entire way in which I've tried to figure out who I am has been largely about tracing the origins of where I've come from. And it's been through, looking at history. Oh, I don't even know where to begin with that. But I think what you talk about, and I think it's the Peter Mitchell quote that you're thinking of from Imperial Nostalgia. We happen to be living through by entering the mythic time of the history we didn't. That's how I open chapter 2, which is my name is Jassa Ahluwalia and I have Imperial Nostalgia. I think for me, I was using history as a way to understand myself. And then without realizing it, I was deeply romanticizing it and being like, this is the time in which, if I existed during this time, then my mixedness, the fact that I am a white-looking, Punjabi-speaking, like Anglo-Indian, I would have been totally at home. And actually all I was doing was just like creating this fantasy world in which I could escape to in my mind and through various history books. And all that history has helped me understand where I come from and why the world is the way it is, and why I love the Paisley design, for example, because I've always associated it with Indian textiles, and yet the rumal that I used to wear to the Gurdwara was actually a silk handkerchief from my white English grandmother, and discovering about how the textile industry was the links between the looms of Paisley in Scotland and the textile industry in India during the colonial period. So all that stuff has given me context. But it didn't give me home, it didn't give me belonging. And then it was when I was reading his Dark Materials, rereading his Dark Materials, that I came across this towards the end of The Amber Spyglass, where Lyra's no longer able to read her alethiometer, and the angel Zephania explains to her that you read it by grace and it has to be attained again through work. And essentially saying that the work of life is to transition from the naivety and the ignorant bliss of childhood to the wisdom and the acquired knowledge of adulthood. And that was great because it was a real slap in the face, because I think I was really looking back longingly with this wistful, nostalgic longing for this bygone era, and really for my childhood as well, not just for the past, but for the childhood where I didn't have to deal with these kinds of things. But then, then being able to, okay, so that's the history. Now I can look ahead and I can start to build my own future with the knowledge of where I've come from and all the things that have led to where we are now. Going back to the English identity thing, knowing the history of English identity has helped me to better engage with English identity as something which I think previously I was just, I don't really know what to do with that. Maybe I'll just discard it. Maybe I don't need it. But actually, the more I've become politically active, the more I want to have a stake and have a say in our country as a citizen, speaking up on behalf of fellow citizens and wanting to engage with others who call this country home. I realize I can't just ignore those things. I have to understand where we've come from to where we are to then have a say in where we go.
One of the things that I struggle with is that I'm Pakistani. I'm British, but I'm Pakistani. My parents are from Pakistan. They came from Pakistan to the UK in the 70s.
Yeah.
What I struggle with so much is that I'm British. I consider myself British. I am part of the fabric of a country that has absolutely pillaged and destroyed where I come from.
Yeah.
And not just where I come from, but a country and many countries, but in particularly where I come from. And I know people across generations, and we still live with the remnants of partition and colonialism. But it was so bloody and violent and brutal. It's something that I struggle with. And that's what, and I think that's a very common experience. And so I think it's important for us to make sure that people just know what happened so that we can talk about history, because we're not taught about it in school. I think getting those stories out, getting the information out is important. But this is actually part of your heritage, like you are English.
Yeah.
How do you navigate some of those complexities, if at all?
I guess like when I go to visit Jallianwala Bagh, and it feels like it's on one side is one side of my family and on the other side is the other side of my, yeah. I guess again it comes down to this, and what I speak towards the end of the book is the general oneness of things. I don't, I think it's very easy to think in terms of there's us and them, and I don't think it's that straightforward. I don't know, I guess if you think about it in terms of human history, then I find it very easy to, like, I don't feel that conflict because I'm a part of human history. Let's take away the countries. Let's actually talk about in terms of class, because actually I think that makes it an easier thing to understand, is that in many ways the white working class in, say, the colonial period had more in common with the colonized than they did with the sort of the elites of the East India Company.
Absolutely, yeah.
I guess I view it all as human history, and I'm a part of that humanity, and I'm trying to find a way through that. So it's not, for me, it's not about where are my loyalties, do I have split loyalties, anything like that. It's that I understand my identity as a British citizen as to mean what that means, which is that is my political identity as a citizen of Britain. I also engage with my English identity because there are laws and stuff that pertain specifically to England. You look at like the COVID restrictions, there were different restrictions in England as opposed to Scotland. So I'm engaging with it in that way. And so I don't really feel a conflict as such, because I think I'm coming to understand what these different parts of me mean in their specific contexts. When I'm going through border control, Heathrow, I'm a British citizen. When I'm traveling in India, I am there if I'm traveling on my British passport, which is how I'd be traveling. I'm a British citizen, but I am also a Punjabi. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to, I don't know, be able to stand for local election or anything, but because I'm not an Indian citizen. So that's, I guess, what this whole process has done is given me a deeper understanding of what some of these labels mean. And that's made it easier for me to be like, all right, I feel comfortable now identifying as British or as English or as Punjabi or as Indian in specific circumstances. And I guess I draw the comparison as well of there are lots of different identities that we hold. I'm also a brother, I'm a son, I'm a writer, I'm an actor. But I guess I don't see the identity things as like these absolutes that are in conflict. I think they are just different bits of expression of bits of who I am in given contexts at given moments in time.
Yeah, that's really insightful. But I wonder if your white privilege in the way that you are white presenting has impacted that particular way that you look at things. I say this because you said, oh, when I'm traveling through security, I'm a British citizen. And obviously, like, I know your name is Jassa. And so I know that it probably makes it a little bit less smooth sailing. But if I compare your experience to my experience, when I travel through Heathrow, I have a British passport, but I'm instantly othered. I know I'm gonna get checked because I wear a hijab, because I'm a brown woman. Like, I know what's gonna happen. I'm instantly othered. And I just wonder, like, thinking about some of those experiences, if it is the privilege of whiteness that maybe makes the experience of being othered different.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying, I'm not in any way suggesting that I'm being othered in those scenarios, nor am I suggesting that my experience of Britishness is the same as your experience, particularly in an instance like that. I guess what I'm saying is that in that particular, I'm engaging with my British identity in terms of what citizenship means, in terms of the relationship between citizen and state. And I think that's why I'm quite emphatic in the book. I talk about the way in which I believe citizenship should be fundamental, and so shouldn't citizenship stripping powers that we've seen used in the instances of like Shamima and stuff like that, I think is outrageous and totally undermines any sort of sense of national unity that if we're striving for a sense of like commonality and national unity, or a sense of a shared identity of some sorts. If the very foundation is that crooked, I don't think it's possible. So I think I'm not talking about pride in my Britishness or the sort of the way in which I find an ease of being British, but it's more that when I talk about being British, I'm talking about my British citizenship, my British identity in what it means to be a citizen. And so I would say that, I guess that sort of speaks to what you're saying about like the differences, that there shouldn't be a difference in the way that you're treated in those scenarios. And I think if we engage more, or I think if there was a greater consciousness of what it means to be British in terms of what it means to be a citizen, then maybe some of these things would be more obvious. So, why are we treating certain citizens differently? Like, how can we possibly claim to be a nation of equals when certain people are being pulled aside for extra random screenings and questioning? It really totally undermines any sort of sense of community.
Yeah, no, that I think definitely makes sense. And you write in the book extensively about British citizenship, and I really enjoyed reading that section because you're so clear on where you stand on it, which is essentially that this is a human right, and there should be basically none, maybe one reason for which somebody can threaten the removal of citizenship of another person. And you said, like, we've gone from like literally 0 reasons to now like loads of reasons. There's like whole groups of people that are like genuinely very worried that their citizenship could be revoked at any time. And I just remember growing up, like my parents always had this thing that was like, tread carefully, don't be too loud, don't be too political, because you never know what's going to happen. You can get in trouble, they'll send us back. And for so long, I just felt like that's never going to happen. You're just being paranoid. It's fine. We're British. It's fine. But now I feel like it could happen. We live in such a bizarre place that it could happen. And I mean, you would be subject to that too if that did happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think I really realized how much I felt that. And I talk about it in the book. There was when Riz Ahmed's short film, The Long Goodbye, came out. And even now, just trying to talk about it, it rises up in me. I remember watching that and just being, I've never been in a state of shock where I can't move. I was like, I don't know if I need to stay on the sofa or if I need to leave the room, because it was just so intense. And I'd just been reading about the Sikh genocide in 1984, and there were parallels and the behaviors and the way in which they raid the house, they separate the men from the women, all that sort of stuff. And my BG had just been like the victim of a home invasion robbery. There'd been like gangs in Leicester that had been targeting South Asian households because of knowing that there tended to be gold in the house. And I think maybe possibly because my granddad's funeral had featured in the local paper because he was a teacher, they may have known that the house was a target. So I just had this, I'd watched this film and then also had this like incident in my own family, and just the sort of incandescent rage of not knowing what to do with this anger and feeling that threat was just, I had never felt it as strongly or as potently as that. And then the guilt as well of being like, I wouldn't be the first person to be attacked in that situation because of the way I look. And it was such a bizarre, weird feeling of, and I think that was partly why I've been so vocal or wanting to really like nail my colours to the mast, is to make it clear where I stand in the fight, and actually make it clear that it is a fight. There is a concerted effort at the moment to define what it means to be someone who belongs in this country. And I have no interest in sitting on the sidelines. This is people's lives. We saw that with Windrush.
Linked to that, you have, I guess, reclaimed the Union Jack somewhat. And I find it so funny because you were saying how like it's in your bio on Instagram.
Yeah.
And I realized that the Union Jack's also in my bio on Instagram, but I think for very different reasons. Mm-hmm. The Union Jack in my bio is just to show publishers that I'm in the UK.
Right, yeah. That's valid and fair. That's what it's literally is. This is the country where you are based.
Can you tell me a little bit about why you've decided to try and use the Union Jack and to try and reframe? Because for a long time, I was feeling very triggered almost when I'd see a bunch of Union Jacks, because I would just be like, oh, this is like an EDL demo, or like the far right is out on the streets. And so actually, was it last year or the year before, there was a lot of like patriotic things happening, the King's coronation and this and that and the other.
Yeah.
And so there were Union Jacks everywhere, or like English flags everywhere. And I was like, oh my gosh, this feels a bit funny to me.
Yeah.
But can you tell me why you've decided to try and, I guess like reclaiming the Union Jack is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, just to be clear, I feel the same way in those scenarios as everything that you've just described. Yeah, like the reason for trying to, maybe I don't even know if I'm reclaiming it, but just using it is a national symbol. It becomes the stories we make it. And I think just for a long time, the story of the national symbols have been used to represent divisive stories. And I don't know, I guess I felt like it is a symbol of the citizenship of the nation, and it doesn't necessarily look now like I think it's very clear from the marches and everything that's going on with the temperature of the nation is outraged, but to read some various bits in the media, it would be that these are like fringe groups and extremists and all of that, and so for me it's about being like finding ways of speaking as a community in its simplest sense. The Union Jack is a symbol of the nation, and it just reflects the stories that we associate with it. So for me, I feel like I'm talking around the houses a bit, but for me, so to take the example of what I talk about in the book is when somebody with a load tried to troll me on Twitter with a load of Union Jacks. And it was in response to me saying that I hadn't come across, prior to this like talk I'd done during the lockdowns, I didn't know about the murder of Gurdeep Singh Chugga in Southall. And actually the response to that racist killing, incredible, the way in which it brought community together, like the Southall youth movement, like Southall Black Sisters, like all the response was incredible. And I was like, that does make me very proud of my British heritage. And that could also be the narrative of the nation. The narrative of the nation could be one of anti-racism, of resistance, of all those things. And I guess the reason, coming back to it, that I'm trying to use and say, I think this is a symbol that it becomes what we make it, is because at the outset, if we look at like the history of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, he wrote this history of England, which is the history that you read. I've quoted most of the introduction in the book. You read it and it sounds a Brexit campaign ad. It's this idea of British exceptionalism. Everything's always getting better. We can do no wrong. We are this great, world-beating nation. That has been the story of the nation from the outset. And that story was told in order to quiet and put down working class movements that were clamoring for greater representation in Parliament and more power and better equality. And I'm like, that's also the story of the nation. It's just that the people in power had the ability to dictate what that story was early on. And I guess what I'm trying to do is be like, we can democratize that storytelling, is that I get to tell that story, you get to tell that story, everybody listening to this gets to tell that story. Obviously, people who have got corporate media have a bigger megaphone in that conversation, but it's not beyond possibility. And I think that for me, and maybe it is a thankless, forever uphill struggle, but I do want to live in a country where there is a sense of community, and just even on a very basic, simple level that, okay, we might come from very different backgrounds and have very different ideas of the world even, but an idea that we are, on some level, there is something that binds us as Brits. I don't think that's a crazy idea. I don't think that's a particularly toxic idea. I think that's something that I would quite like. And so for me, that's what, by engaging with our national symbols, that's what I'm trying to do. And very explicitly, I'm talking about the flag as a explicitly like national civic symbol. For me, engaging with the Union Jack does not make me, I'm very clear about what my position is on the monarchy in the book. And I did take, and I said I felt a bit weird about it, but I took the Union Jack along to a trade unions protest a while back, and I did get a lot of funny looks, and I felt a bit weird. But it was an interesting experiment for me, because I was like, there is something quite powerful about being at this, like a rally, a protest, which is about challenging those in power, and doing it and waving a flag and this is the people of Britain declaring that we do not agree with the way in which you are leading the country. And so, yeah, it's a way, again, I guess, of resisting this idea that to be critical of those in power or those with wealth and power is somehow a traitorous, treacherous act, that you should be, don't like it, there's the door. I'm like, no, this is, don't like it, I want to change it from within. So yeah, that's probably where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah, reading the section, I was just reflecting on the fact that, and I think you mentioned this in the book as well, that around the world, and obviously there are some countries where this is not the case, but around the world, a flag of a country is like a sign of resistance, or just a really like a joyous thing.
Yeah,
like this is who we are. We're happy to be who we are. But in Britain, despite the fact that the Union Jack has come, as you said, has come to show us about unity and somewhat diversity and history, it has now been co-opted largely by the far right, who are racist and trying to say that Britain is in a certain way. But actually, what you're saying is that, and what I think of what I'm saying is that all the things that I am critical of when it comes to the government, in terms of the way that it treats its working class community, the way that it treats communities of colour, its foreign policy, it's the way that it treats refugees and asylum seekers, etc., etc. I genuinely think that this is not aligned with what it means to be British.
Yeah.
These are not British values. And I guess this is what you said, is that you want to show that it's not the ideas of the far right that are British. What is British is justice and equality and treating people fair and being kind and protecting and upholding human rights. Those are British values. And that not only is that the Union Jack is co-opted by the far right, but that because we don't have an alignment anymore with these good values where we're looking after people, I feel really sad when I see a Union Jack, because I don't feel that sense of affinity or that sense of pride, just because of the fact that these values are no longer there.
Yeah, I would say that I guess the story of the nation is the story we choose to tell, and I think
Mm.
that's what It's very sad to see what story those who are in power are telling at the moment. It's not a
Mm.
very nice story,
Yeah.
but I think I don't think you can just ignore it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why when I did my TED talk, I was very happy to discard my sense of national identity, because that was the easiest way for me to reconcile my mixed heritage identity. But actually now, because of my mixed heritage identity, I want to help reshape what it means to be British. Because actually, I think, yeah, I don't even know if there ever were. Like, British values have been this very amorphous, undefined thing with very vague terms, rule of law and all that. What does rule of law mean when the law can deport people to Rwanda?
Or
But
strip people of their citizenship.
yeah, and I think national identity, but necessarily has to be an ongoing process. You
Yeah.
can, because times change, people change, ideas, values change, and then perhaps there maybe is some value in setting certain things down in stone, like I guess like with the US Constitution. But then you've got like stuff like the right to bear arms, and the sort of the problems that throws up when something can be so rigid. There is something to be said for the fluidity and flexibility of the British system. But at the moment, that seems to only be in service of those with wealth and power, and
Yeah.
they get to decide what the narrative is. If they don't like it, they can change it. And that's why I guess I'm engaging with my Britishness and engaging with national symbols as a way of saying that I refuse to be told what it means to be British. I
Yeah.
get to decide what it means to be British for myself. And maybe others will disagree. That's fine. But I'm not going to be silenced in this conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a really like a really nice way. I want to use a better word than nice, but it's a really nice way to, I guess, to resist, because it's one thing disagreeing with policy and doing something about it politically, like going on a protest, signing a
Mm.
petition, writing to your MP. That is that, and that absolutely should continue. But it's really interesting to frame it in the way of national identity. I think it gives us like a bigger picture. It gives us something to think about more long term, something to think about more as groups and as a bigger community. I actually think that there's something really of value there. So I really enjoyed reading about that in the book, and your exploration of that I think is very interesting. I will keep the Union Jack in my bio on Instagram.
I'm also like well aware that certain people will be like, nah, never. This is a long process. But yeah, I think I think exactly what you said is when we are on the streets, when we're protesting and we're asking for things to be changed. It's like, what do we ask? What is it we're really asking for? We're asking to live in a country that has, what am I trying to say? I guess what we're demanding on the streets is what we want our nation to be. And so
Yeah.
I think, who knows? I'm like, look,
I think it's really easy to become really disillusioned with the government and with politics and with the state. And we've seen that just very recently. We had local elections and we had very low voter turnout. I guess this is a way to just change the thinking a little bit. And I just think that it's good. It's interesting. And so you are a trade unionist. And I just wondered how you are feeling about trade unions and the working class, especially within this climate when trade unions are, we're talking about laws that are being trying to be passed to ban trade unions and to limit their powers,
yeah,
and to really criticize trade union action like the train strikes and those kind of things. Because I think trade unions have immense power, and I think are so important for the working class, especially the way that we are demonized and targeted by the government. But what are your thoughts?
I think the reason trade unions are being so attacked and have been attacked so consistently in Britain since the sort of late 70s, 80s is because they work, they're effective. I was having this conversation with somebody recently. I was like, look at where the laws get made. You have issues, you have various culture war issues, but the laws are being pushed through when it comes to trade unions because they are effective. And that's why I'm such a vocal proponent of trade unionism, and the fact that they are being attacked and disempowered I don't think is a cause for resistance. I don't think it's a cause for despair. I think it's a cause for hope as well, because they feel threatened. Those with wealth and power feel threatened, and therefore they are trying to shut down one of the few means that we have of fighting back. And I think trade unions are like one of the most effective means of engaging democratically, of being protected at work. I think we need to be engaging with our trade unions to shape them. I think we basically forgotten, or I grew up at a time where awareness of trade unions was very low within the post-Thatcherite era, where trade unions had really been pushed to or crushed. So there was no real understanding, at least for me growing up, that trade unions were a means of being politically engaged. Because we have this with member of I'm part of the council, the sort of the executive body, and we are a non-politically affiliated union, but that does not make us a apolitical organization. To be existing as a trade union in a capitalist society, that is political, and there is a democratic organization, and it is a way of having like a meaningful say and direct involvement, whether it's through acts of solidarity, going on protests. But during the RMT strikes, with the rail strikes, we were able to offer our support. We donated to the RMT strike fund.
I think trade unions are great. And you're right, like I remember as well, so we were actually born in the same year, you and I, Jassa,
really?
1990. Yeah. And like I don't remember there being much talk of striking or trade union activity at all growing up. I don't think I remember my teachers ever really going on strike until I think past 2010, I'd say.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think, as you've said, I think they're incredibly important and have immense power. As we've established, you've covered so many different things in your book. And I think they're all different aspects of your identity, and I guess you understanding and exploring different parts of your identity. How did you decide what this book was going to be? What was that like?
So I thought I knew what the book was when I started to write. I thought it was either going to be Both Not Half is where we begin and everything that comes after it. I tried writing that version of the book, and I was basically trying to write a new history of the world from the perspective of Both Not Half. And it was like, this is ridiculous. I am not an academic. This is way too much work. Why am I trying to do this? This is crazy. And I realized that there was a lot of ego in that. I was trying to prove something to myself. I dropped out of uni at the start of my second year, and I'd had this thing lingering in the back of my head of, would I have ever really passed? And it's crazy. And I think this is largely a lot of pressure I put on myself, because I'd always been done quite well at school, and so I'd put a lot of pressure on myself. And suddenly I thought I was trying to write this book, and it had to be the most perfect thing. And then the other version of the book was that the Both Not Half is the answer, it's the end. And I thought that was the book for a while, that actually all I had to do was explain the journey up until Both Not Half. And then I had a real moment of crisis when I was trying to write the sample chapter, and I realized that I needed to restructure how I was approaching it, because I didn't really know what I was doing. And I was like, you know what, let's stop trying to write a non-fiction book. And what do I know? I know story, scripts, characters. So I was like, let's reapproach this. Imagine it's a film script. How would I be structuring this? What would be the opening image? What would be the sort of the inciting incident? What's the world that gets turned upside down? What's the adventure we go on? What are the lessons learned, the stumbling blocks, all of that? And then I reframed it all. And then suddenly I was like, oh, the moment of realization of Both Not Half is actually the middle of the book. It's Aladdin finding the lamp and the genie. It doesn't start with the genie, nor does it end with it. That's the bit in the middle where everything starts to happen. And I realized that Both Not Half was in many ways like this genie that I'd unleashed. And it did start to make the world look different. And I realized that actually, I was still, and I think you said this earlier, I'm very much still on this journey. And I realized that I was still on this journey. And so I started writing the book from the middle to the end, because actually that was the bit that was still new and that I was figuring out. So I think the very first chapter I wrote was the one on national identity, on fictions, useful fictions, dangerous narratives. I wrote that, then went on to exploring like gender and sexuality, the trade union stuff, and then the faith and spirituality aspect of the conclusion. So I finished the book before I finished the book, if that makes sense. I wrote the ending of the book before I'd finished the book. And then I went back to the start, and then I wrote from the start back to the middle, because I was like, that's the bit of the journey that I know more. And there was still lots of new research to do there as well, particularly around the history of Anglo-Indians, and the nostalgia stuff that we've touched on earlier. But that bit of the story made more sense. And then it came together. I was like, this is actually really what the whole book is about, is this journey of my personal transformation from this state of ignorant bliss as a child, having this realization that there was something about my identity that I needed to figure out, going out, trying to find an answer, finding Both Not Half. And then it was the journey of return then, of like, how does Both Not Half change my relationship with myself and the world? And how do I find a way of finding peace with that and myself, and I guess a sort of freedom, a liberation, which is really what I got to by the end of the writing process. And the end really caught me off guard. Like, I wrote the end and I didn't realize I'd written the end. I wrote the final line, and then I just looked at it. I was like, oh yeah, that's the end. And I found that like conclusion, and that came just from reframing it as a story. And it is a story. It's a non-fiction, but I hope you can tell me, but I hope that it reads with the sort of the pace and structure and arc and development of a more of a novel, even that. And then there's lots of the history, non-fiction research stuff that's in there to support that. Yeah.
The end of the book, and I think the whole last chapter, it feels, and I guess because it is about spirituality, and it's like inward and like and like, it felt really different. It felt, I think most of that chapter to me felt like I was reading a diary entry. Like it's very personal, it's very quite deep, and also you're moving, you're traveling, you're going to different places, but there's so much, I think, like emotional growth and change and like realization, discovery that happens within that book. So I think if we think about a story, it almost feels like in a very cliched way, you have this life-changing or life-affirming experience, this awakening almost. Also, it's, if we take away anything from the book, it's exactly that. That is not what happened. It's not one moment. You had an aha moment and suddenly everything is okay. There's a whole load of things that led up to that moment in itself even happening. And then, as we said, you're still on this journey. How did it feel? Because that was very different, I felt, as a reader, to the rest of the book, even though you do throughout the book, you tell stories about your family and your childhood. How did it feel like being almost bringing out onto the page so much of what's inside?
It didn't feel that strange, because I feel like all the stuff that I talk about in the final chapter is the stuff that informs all the other stuff. You know, it's my sense of oneness and connectedness to everyone and everything that informs my desire to create a sense of community through nationhood. It is the same thing that inspires me to want to break down ideas of strict gender and sexuality norms. It's the same thing that fuels the trade unionism and the fight for justice. So it didn't seem, at least to me when I was writing it, different or divorced from what I was talking about. But I guess it becomes, by virtue of it being much more inward looking, it becomes more personal. And I do go back and I discuss some of my early experiences of Sikhi and what faith and religion meant to me as a kid. So in a way I quite enjoyed it, because I'd done all this sort of quite research heavy stuff and like political stuff, and then I was like, oh, now I can do some back to my childhood. This is fun. But yeah, I think it was also, that was the most it's the most towards the end of the chapter, the very end of the book, is like the most recent stuff. And I think the events of that take place in March 2023, so about a year ago. And I think it was the culmination of everything. It was the whole journey up to there. It got to that point. Even though it was more personal and it feels quite exposing and vulnerable, because I got to the end of the journey, I understood where I was at, and there was a sort of a deep sense of contentment that I discovered along the way. It was no longer in any way scary to share any of that, because I think I mean, firstly, when I was writing it, I knew that if it was scary, I could cut. Like there was no, when I was writing it, there was no sort of commitment that this is what is going to end up being printed. As it is, a lot of what the first draft was is what the final draft is. But yeah, I think I just got to the point where I was like, oh, I know who I am. I know what this journey has been, and therefore sharing that and sharing the confusions and the discoveries along the way, there didn't feel anything particularly scary about doing that. If anything, it felt quite joyful. And I think maybe what I found really wonderful about the final chapter is I've not really come across much stuff which talks about relationship with faith and the spiritual and the philosophical in the same breath as like the political and the sort of the memoir aspect. I don't know, like the whole, it's used, there's books on that stuff, and then there's books about like political activism. And for me, probably the biggest discovery when I was going back and looking at the timelines was that the same night that I posted the first Both Not Half video, before I'd even articulated Both Not Half, the first video of me speaking Punjabi online, was that the very same night I sent a message to a mate of mine, because we just started talking about like stoicism, and I've been reading up about like a lot of like Sikh stuff, and it was like literally the same night. And I realized that actually the whole journey has been about trying to figure out who I am and how to live. And so I guess for me, it's not a surprise that, yeah, it doesn't feel strange to me. They are part of the same conversation.
I really love that, reading about that, because I have a really similar experience with that. So like you, I studied A-level politics and in E2, so we did political philosophy.
Right.
I constantly found myself drawn to like world-based philosophy that was written by people talking about how society should be set up. I was like obsessed with trying to find one that I felt like matched my religious ideas and my identity. And obviously I was a teenager, like 17, right? 16, 17, 15, 16, I don't know how old I was, 16. So I didn't have, I don't think, like very complex ideas about philosophy or faith. Like I think to me, it felt just, okay, this is who I am and this is what I do and this is what I believe and da-da. But I think then I got to an age where I was realizing that the world is so much bigger than me and my family and me and my friends and this community, and there's so much going on and there's so much that we are connected to. Mm-hmm. And so I think I was always like, and I still am, like I'm still really interested in philosophy and different ideas and how they sit with my own faith, and how sometimes, although like in Islam, like we have in like history and from the Quran, like we have countless examples of how like different ideas and values are brought out in the real world. But it's, I think, so interesting to look at it from a different lens. And it's really nice because also to then link it to political activism and where you stand in the world today. Because it is, I think, a lot of the way that faith is perceived is often different to like how you present yourself politically. Mm-hmm. There doesn't seem to be an understanding or like a great enough acceptance that your faith or your philosophy can really inspire your politics. I think especially, I don't know if you've had the experience, but I have felt very much like sometimes people will look at people of a religion or people of faith or people that believe in God as less enlightened or like dogmatic. And it's a really harmful way of looking at faith, but it happens.
Yeah.
And so then like they will take your perception of the world or your politics in a very different way. So I really enjoyed reading about your exploration of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is probably one of the most surprising elements for me as well, because it really made me question, firstly, two parts of it. So I think the history of the Sikhs is replete with examples of political resistance. So I think for me, finding the parallels was perhaps easier, or I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be speaking comparatives, but I found it quite easy to find the parallels to be like, should I be out on the street? Yes. Also, this idea of what do we mean when we're talking about the divine, when we're talking about, if we want to use the word God or the ultimate or the one or whatever. And for me, the more the Guru Granth Sahib, Japji Sahib, like the actual scriptures had always felt quite at a distance from me, like I didn't really understand it. But when I started to really engage with it, just initially out of purely a intellectual curiosity as to be like, what does this stuff actually mean? And I approached it very much with, do I actually even agree with this? Like, do I want to be associating myself with this? I've always felt quite comfortable in my Sikh identity culturally, but what does it mean to be a Sikh? And started understanding it and reading it and finding commentaries. And then to understand that actually what a lot of what Guru Nanak was talking about, and also like the Sufi mystics who are also the contributors and writers. You got like Kabir, who's contributed a lot in the Guru Granth Sahib. They're talking about the sort of the sense of the self being dissolved in moments of beauty and bliss, or it could even be in moments of struggle, like the idea, but basically the idea of the self and the other being merged, self and everything being merged, and that sense of separation being dissolved. And so I came to that because I was like, this sort of makes sense to me as somebody trying to make sense of these two parts of myself. And actually, if everything is in the sort of like the ultimate analysis where distinction doesn't really exist, then this makes things a lot easier for me. And in that, I was like, because I'd grown up with this idea that God was like this old dude in the sky, and actually discovering that there was this whole other way of thinking about what the divine is was wonderful, because I was like, I know that, I've experienced that when I've been out walking in the wilds, or when I'm listening to koalis, or I know that feeling. And then to realize that is actually what a lot of the scriptures talking about, and that I've since found parallels in other traditions, whether it's like the Hindu, Buddhist, or like the tantric traditions that influence both, or like the Sufi Islam. Like for me, like the concept of Tawhid is just so similar in many ways to Ik. I know that's more of a Sufi interpretation, but yeah, that for me, I was like, oh wow, this is wonderful, because it's trying to find a way to give expression to the sense of awe and wonder that we experience in the world. And that to me was finding that in a way that then also allowed me to deepen my connection with my roots and my heritage and culture, I think was, and so inevitably then I think it just informs every other aspect of life as well. Yeah,
that's really beautiful, that is. And just, I really enjoy speaking to you today. And just as we wrap up, my final question for you is, what do you hope as people pick up Both Not Half? What do you hope that they take away from your work?
My hope for anybody picking up Both Not Half, regardless of whatever their background is for them to maybe realize and understand that none of us are fractional and fragmented, and that we are all whole and multiple. I think if that's the one thing people can take away, is the idea that, and I'm sure all of us at some point have felt like we don't belong, we don't fit in. But I think to take away, we are whole and multiple, and that is a wonderful thing. I think that is what I'd like people to take away.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Jassa, for your final comments, but for your time today. It has been so wonderful speaking to you.
Thank you so much, Samia. I've really enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would love to hear from you. It would also mean so much to me if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.